Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to NatCen's British Social Attitudes event. Welcome to those of you who have made it here in person, and to the many hundreds of you joining us online. I have to say to those of you in the room, thank you for overcoming the tube strike hurdles today. We're genuinely grateful that you made the effort. It's a testament to the importance of what we're about to discuss that so many of you did find the way in today. And for those of you joining online, I hope the quality of what you're about to hear more than makes up for the missing refreshments. So we're here today to discuss the latest findings of the British Social Attitudes Survey, Britain's longest running survey of public opinion, first fielding in 1983, and now in its fifth decade of tackling what the British public really thinks about issues that shape society and politics. Now, today's findings cover two subjects that could not be more timely. First, we'll be examining what really drives support for Reform UK. And I think that many of you will find the conclusions more nuanced and more significant than some of the headlines this week might suggest. And second, we're going to turn to higher education, where public confidence in the value of the degree has fallen to a record low. And to unpack both sets of findings, we have an exceptional panel with us today. We have Professor Sir John Curtice, Senior Research Fellow at NatCen and co-author of our Reform chapter. We have Alex Scholes, Research Director at NatCen and co-author of the Higher Education chapter. Annabel Denham, Senior Political Commentator at The Telegraph. And Professor Diana Beach, Director of the Finsbury Institute at the City St George's University of London. We were discussing that merger earlier and I knew I would get it wrong. Apologies. We will hear short presentations from John and Alex, followed by responses from Annabel and Diana, before opening up to a panel discussion and your questions. It promises to be a lively morning, so let's get started, and over to you, John.
Thank you very much, and thank you for negotiating the tube strike. If it's any consolation to you, the overnight sleeper from London arrived an hour earlier this morning, so that certainly made it easier to get onto the tube before it got very busy. This is a chapter about support for reform. Reform have now been ahead in the opinion polls, running at around 30% or so since the spring of last year, so now for just over a year. And so we thought we would use the wide range of data that's collected in any year's British Social Attitudes report to look perhaps more deeply than anybody's been able to do so far, to look at what is the attitudinal profile and also the demographic profile of those people who support reform. The essential question that the chapter tries to address is essentially, is it simply a protest movement? Is it simply a body of people who say the economy doesn't work, the NHS doesn't work, and yes, we don't seem to be able to control immigration, and that it's essentially therefore a phenomenon that is rooted in the many public policy challenges that have faced both the previous government and the current government, and which both of them have struggled to deal with, and that this is the product of the disillusion amongst the public that's occurred as a result? Or is it about something that's much more based in a particular set of values and a particular set of ideologies? After all, the organisational history of reform goes back to Brexit and to UKIP, and we might therefore anticipate that those who support reform are people who are in favour of being outside the European Union. And we know from previous research we've done on British social attitudes that the folk who voted for leaving had a very distinctive set of attitudes and a very distinctive set of demographic profile. And so are we basically looking at the same phenomenon, as it were, reincarnated now in the form of reform? Now, before I go any further, though probably most of you are familiar with most of this, what is the British Social Attitudes Survey? It's an annual survey that's been done by the National Centre all the way back since 1983, and yes, I was in the building in 1983, though I was not involved in its initial development. Crucially, as compared with most opinion polling, This is a random probability-based sampling, i.e. nobody can volunteer to do British social attitudes. Everybody is picked, and they're effectively picked at random. Historically, it's been done face-to-face, so an interviewer would turn up, knock on the door and say, hello, hard luck, your address has been picked up by the computer. There's an address at which I need to conduct an interview. Can you tell me who lives here, please? And then the computer would tell them which of the individuals living in that household needed to be interviewed. Now, we were already thinking about changing this, but the pandemic, as it were, caused a fast forward. And so more recently, it's been done by what's the so-called push-to-web design. But again, it's at random. Addresses are selected at random. They're sent letters, they're sent links to get onto the web to be able to complete the survey. So anyway, just under 5,000 people were interviewed. Not all the questions were asked of everybody, but 5,000 people were interviewed basically in the early autumn of last year, which is basically around the time when support for reform, according to the opinion polls, actually reached its peak of around 32%. Okay, so is it just a protest phenomenon? Well, certainly, as you can see here, there are aspects of the attitudes of reform supporters that do mark them out as being disproportionately amongst the most discontented. So on the left-hand side, showing you the proportion of people who are very dissatisfied with the NHS. That is a widespread feeling. It's felt by half of the public, but in the case of reform, it's three-fifths of reform voters who take that, supporters who take that view. Equally, they're rather more likely to say they are struggling on their current income, although the gap is not that wide. What does mark them out, though, is very clearly a feeling that the way this country is governed needs a great deal of improvement. That's a perception that around 2/5 of people hold in general, but it's 3/4 of reform supporters. So there is no doubt, in part, the rise of reform does seem to be, at least in part, rooted in discontent. One of the phrases that sometimes, or terms that sometimes used to describe reform, perhaps sometimes disparagingly, is that it's populist, that it's articulating a populist view of the world, a view of the world that essentially says, you know what, it's the ordinary folk who actually have the common sense to know what public policy should be. But the trouble is we're governed by an elite that's rather corrupt and certainly doesn't share the values of the general public, and therefore that's why government doesn't work. Now, there's a variety of items that lie behind this. So people make decisions, that the people should make the decisions, not policymakers. That politicians talk too much and do far little, do much less. And also that there's a conflict between ordinary people and those who are powerful. Now, some of these items are actually, quite widely agreed with by the public in general. So a lot of people think that politicians, frankly, talk too much and don't do enough. And indeed, there's a quite widespread perception there's a conflict. But as you can see by comparing the purple bars with the orange bars, that reform supporters are somewhat more likely to acquiesce and to agree with these propositions than the public in general. So to describe it as simply a populist movement would certainly be too strong, but there are elements, again, of a populist outlook behind reform support. But what about ideology? What about values? Well, here are 4 relatively concrete examples of ways in which the attitudes of reform supporters really are different from those of the rest of the general public. And then I'll put this into a bit of a conceptual framework in a moment. So number 1, this one probably doesn't surprise you. They're much more concerned about immigration. They are much more likely to feel that migrants who come to the UK to live and work undermine our culture rather than enrich it. On that, there's a 40-point gap between the views of reform supporters and the views of the general public. On equal opportunities, here's an example to do with transgender people. It's there, by the way, also in attitudes towards equal opportunities from those ethnic minority backgrounds, an issue which has risen up the agenda in the wake of the Henry Novak murder and the controversy surrounding that. But again, on all equalities policies, indeed, reform supporters reflect the views that are being articulated by reform, which is they think these things have been going too far. They are also relatively sceptical about climate change, Nearly a half of them think either it doesn't exist, or that if it does exist, it's the result of natural processes, not as the result of human activity. And they're also somewhat more censorious about welfare. So, for example, they're rather more likely to think that welfare the unemployment benefit is too high. Now, behind this, and what you will see in the chapter, is to say, well, actually, what you're seeing there are examples, for the most part, of a broader ideological division, which we can characterize in different ways, but I'm going to use this morning social conservatives versus social liberals. So social liberals are indeed the folk who are comfortable living in a diverse society, think it's up to you what language you speak, what identity you have, etc., etc. Social conservatives, in contrast, say, no, actually, if society is going to cohere, there does need to be, for example, a common moral code, adherence to common mores. It's important that people speak English, that they acknowledge a sense of British identity. Crucial thing, as you can see here, is that once we divide people, as we're able to do in the survey, between these groups, what you discover is that support for reform is very, very heavily embedded amongst the socially conservative section of our population. So also, to some degree, is support for the Conservative Party, but less so. And then at the other end of the spectrum in particular are the Greens. The Greens are actually now appealing to the social liberals, and the Labour Party also, despite its best endeavours, is also primarily heavily more popular amongst that world. Now, this division between social conservatives and social liberals was the division that underlay the division between Remainers and Leavers back in 2016. So therefore, it won't surprise you to hear that nearly a half of those people who currently support reform would vote to stay out of the European Union, whereas amongst those who would vote to rejoin, less than 1 in 10 are reform supporters. And equally, reform supporters are rather more sympathetic to the idea that our best interests lie in alignment with the United States rather than with Europe. In contrast, and this is where one of the things the chapter is saying is, don't think of reform as being particularly right-wing. When we come to issues of equality, reform supporters, they're a little bit less concerned about it, but they're nothing like as right-wing as conservative supporters, and they're nothing like so far away from the general public. So take inheritance tax, for example, a classic public policy designed to try to reduce inequality in our society. Now, it's not very popular in general. Over a half of the public, of the general public, are opposed to inheritance tax. But then you can see that conservative supporters, the figure is around 3/4, and for reform supporters, it's only around 2/3. They are not as right-wing on this issue as are conservative supporters, and equally on perceptions of child poverty. Again, yes, reform supporters are somewhat less likely to acknowledge child poverty, but again, they're not as distinctive as are conservative supporters. And this does therefore mean that when we use another set of scales, which British Social Action has been running for years, which is designed to measure where people stand on the right-left spectrum, i.e. whether or not you are somebody who believes that there is too much inequality and the state should be trying to do something about it, or whether you think the state should be trying to provide the circumstances under which the economy will grow, from which then everybody will profit. As you can see, support for reform amongst those on the right is a little bit higher than it is amongst those on the left, but it's only a 6-point gap. Compare that with the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party support is much more clearly rooted in those who are on the economic right than is support for reform. Labour Party, unsurprisingly, is amongst those who are on the economic left. And the Greens share their social liberalism, and they combine it with being relatively left-wing. And that's one of the ways in which the Greens are different from reform. They're just not the complete opposite, because the Greens are both left-wing and social liberal. Reform are socially conservative and only a wee bit right-wing. Okay, what about, therefore, who are the kinds of people who are supporting reform? For anybody who's worked in this field for the last 10 years or so, it's been very familiar. They are much more popular amongst people who are not university graduates than they are amongst those people who have been to university. They are more popular amongst older people than amongst younger people. and they are more popular amongst men than amongst women. And indeed, that latter division is particularly marked amongst the younger end of the age group, as a result of which basically young men are as likely to support reform as are older women. These, however, is also the demography of the Leave vote in 2016. It is very, very similar to what happened in terms of the basis of the Leave vote 10 years ago. But what about the rise in support for reform since the 2024 election? Well, basically, it's more of the same. So ideologically, support for reform has risen primarily amongst social conservatives, very little about social liberals. Another reason why not to think that this is simply the product of protest against, for example, perceived failures of the current government. And equally, in terms of demography, where has support for reform risen most? It's tended to rise much more amongst those people who are not graduates, amongst older people, and again amongst men. So it's not just a protest movement. It is ideologically very distinct, but the terms right versus left do not capture the distinctiveness of reform. Rather, reform support is socially conservative Britain, of which supporting Brexit is very much a signifier. And crucially, what you need to understand is that whether you are right-wing or left-wing is almost wholly unrelated to whether you are a social liberal or a social conservative. These are two dimensions, and our political space now is two-dimensional rather than one-dimensional. The demography mimics the pattern of support for Leave, and it is in effect the coalition of people who voted in 2019 to get Brexit done, but they've now departed the Conservative Party, who delivered Brexit, but then disappointed many Brexiteers with the way in which it turned out. So therefore, while turning around the economy and turning around the NHS may help those parties that are trying to reduce support for reform, I don't think that we should anticipate that that's going to be sufficient, and that there is now a crucial battle going on, and it's primarily a battle between the Conservative Party and Reform, and it's a battle that at the moment Reform are winning for the support of those who are part of socially conservative Britain.
Thank you so much, John. That was fascinating, and I think it's probably posed quite a few questions in the room. But before we do so, I'm going to pass on to Alex, who's going to talk about our higher education chapter.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to run through the latest figures on higher education. So since BSA first started asking some of these questions on higher education in 1983, the sector has undergone a remarkable amount of change. The proportion of people who are going on to university has increased, and the number of universities has increased as well. So we were really interested in how attitudes have shifted given that change in context. So the three key questions we were concerned with in this report was, one, do the public still think a significant proportion of young people should go on to university and obtain a degree? Do the public still perceive a university education to be beneficial to graduates? And finally, do the public still think that students should pay? And if they do, what would be a fair price? And just to note, given the four divergent systems across the four nations of the UK, for the sake of simplicity, we focus primarily on attitudes in England in this report. So let's take the first question first on the size of the university sector and whether there has been any public reaction to university expansion. So BSA has asked respondents since 1983 the following question: do you feel that opportunities for young people in Britain to go on to higher education should be increased or reduced? So then we've got the proportion who think it should be reduced, the bottom line in green. Proportion who think they're at the right level is the line in yellow, and the proportion who think it should be increased is the line in purple. So starting when we first asked the question in 1983 and up to the 21st century, the proportion who thought opportunities should be reduced was fairly low, knocking around 5%, and the proportion who thought opportunities should be either increased or are at the right level stayed between the low 40s and 50%. And then from the early 2000s onwards, we've seen a greater degree of fluctuations. There was a noted shift in 2004. Some people will note that was when top-up fees of £3,000 were first introduced. As a proportion of people who thought opportunities should be reduced, green line at the bottom, steadily increased, and the proportion who thought they should be increased, the purple line, dropped at the same time. So we've seen a degree of fluctuation since then. And there is perhaps some sign in the more recent data of a reaction against university expansion. So the proportion of people who feel opportunities should be reduced has increased from 11 percentage points when we last asked the question to 18 percentage points in our most recent data, while the proportions who think they should be increased or are at the right level have declined. But on the other hand, views have tended to fluctuate over time, which makes it difficult to say whether this recent shift is a start of a discernible trend or just more of the same fluctuation we've seen previously. As well as asking people whether they thought opportunities should be increased or decreased, we also asked people's thoughts on whether we are producing the right number of graduates for the job market. And this chart shows a proportion of people who think there are too many, about the right amount, or not enough recent university graduates in 2025, the bar at the top, and in 2014, when we last asked the question, the bar at the bottom. So as you can see, there's not been a lot of change over time in the past decade in people's views on this question. It's still the case that around 4 in 10 of us believe that there are either too many recent university graduates or about the right number. So recent graduate difficulties in the job market have, as yet, on these questions, had little impact on public perceptions of university expansion. If we examine responses to this question by educational level, we can see, as this chart shows, a difference in views between those with and without a degree. So around half of those with a degree believe there are too many recent university graduates, compared with 4 in 10 of those who don't have a degree. So their more direct experience of the university graduate job market and the difficulties therein may help to explain why those with a degree are more likely to feel the market is saturated than those who are observing that market from the outside. As well as a divide between graduates and non-graduates, there's also a political divide. This chart shows a proportion who feel opportunities for young people to go on to higher education should be reduced, either a little or a lot, by party political support. So as can be seen, a third of Conservative supporters think these opportunities should be reduced, as well as around a quarter of Reform supporters, 2 bars on the right. In contrast, those on the left of the political spectrum are less keen on having opportunities for higher education to be reduced, and it's between 11 and 13% of Labour, Lib Dem and Green supporters who take this view. So there may be some somewhat mixed evidence of a reaction against university expansion, but if we turn to our second question as to whether a university education is still viewed as worthwhile, we see a much clearer trend. So what this chart shows is a level of agreement with 2 statements. So the statement on the left is, in the long run, people who go to university end up being a lot better off financially than those who don't. And on the right, a university education just isn't worth the amount of time and money it usually takes. And we've got 3 years there. 2005 is when we first asked the question. 2018, the pink bar, is when we last asked the question previous to the most recent data, and the green bar is our most recent data in 2025. So as can be seen, the proportion of people who believe that people benefit financially from going on to university has declined. Half of us believe this in 2005, whereas 36% 20 years later. Meanwhile, the proportion of people who think that a university education, it just isn't worth the amount of time and money it usually takes, has increased. So that was only 14% of us thought that in 2005, and now it's close to 1 in 3 of us who think that today. So people have therefore become less convinced that a university education is a worthwhile endeavour. So graduates may be more likely than non-grads to feel that higher education opportunities should be reduced, but they are still more likely to perceive a university education to be worthwhile. So a person without a degree is 12 percentage points more likely to say that a university education just isn't worth the amount of time and money it usually takes. However, what's particularly interesting is that those with a university degree are not just a homogenous block. So those who turned 18 during the era of free university tuition, the bar in the middle, are more positive than those who have had to pay fees, either at the lower level of £1,000 to £3,000 or at the higher level of £9,000 plus, about whether a university education is worthwhile or not. So perhaps the combination of having to incur a certain level of debt to go on to university and the more challenging recent graduate job market have contributed to a greater level of disillusionment among this cohort. If we examine attitudes to this question by party political support, meanwhile, there is evidence of a right-left split on this as well. So those on the right of the political spectrum and on the right of this chart are generally more sceptical of the value of higher education than those on the political left. So as shown, reform voters are the most sceptical. Around 4 in 10 think that university education just isn't worth the amount of the time and effort involved, while only around 1 in 10 of them think that it is. And Tories are also significantly more likely to agree with this statement than disagree, whereas Green and Labour voters are more evenly split. Lib Dems come out as somewhat of an outlier here, over half of them broadly positive about the benefits of a university education, and only 1 in 5 agree that it's not worth the time and effort. So turning to our final question on attitudes towards fees, this chart shows views on responsibility for paying the costs of tuition fees from when we first asked the question in 2004. So the line at the top are those who take the middle option, that some students or families should pay for the cost of tuition. The green line is those who think that no students or families should pay, and the purple line at the bottom is the proportion who think that all students and families should pay. So a couple of key things to note. One, we've seen a decline from when we last asked the question around a decade ago in the proportion selecting the middle option of some, which suggests views are perhaps becoming a little bit more polarised on this question. Also, the proportion selecting none has sort of steadily increased from 2010. It was 16% who thought this back then, and whereas in our latest survey, 27% think that no students or families at all should be paying for the cost of tuition. There is, as might be expected, a political divide in attitudes towards who should pay for tuition, but interestingly, unlike the other questions, it doesn't necessarily fit into a neat right-left divide. So Green supporters are certainly outliers on this question. So a substantial 45% of them believe that no students or families should be paying for the cost of their university tuition. Conservative and Lib Dem supporters are the least in favour of no students or families paying, so around 1 in 5 of each of them believe this. But interestingly, Reform and Labour are closer on this question than they are in the other questions that we asked on the report. So perhaps Nigel Farage's more critical comments about the student loan system, I think he compared it to usury in one of his comments, has been influential in Reform voters' attitudes, or reflective of them at least. We also asked respondents for their views on where the tuition fee cap and the repayment threshold, after which graduates start to repay their student loan, should be. So the figures on the left are attitudes towards tuition fees. So although most people believe at least some students should be contributing towards the cost of their tuition, 6 in 10 of us believe that the amount they should contribute should be capped at a lower level than it is currently. But when it comes to the repayment threshold, which is currently set at about 27k, which is the salary at which graduates start to pay back their student loan, attitudes are a little bit more evenly split. So just under a half think that this should be set at a lower level than it is currently, and 4 in 10 believe it should actually be set at a higher rate. So on the size of the sector, public attitudes fairly stable. While there's been some fluctuation in attitudes over time, it's difficult to say that there's a clear or sustained backlash to expansion. However, concerns about graduate numbers have persisted. Around 4 in 10 people think and still think there are too many graduates for the current job market, which suggests ongoing doubts about how well it's aligning with the needs of the labour market. Where we have seen a clearer shift is in perceptions of value. So confidence in the financial benefits of going on to university education have decreased notably, and skepticism, while it's skepticism about whether it's just worth the time and money involved, have increased. These views aren't uniform. They vary by level of education, by when you got your degree, and if you did get a degree, and the fees that would have been inherent at that time, and by party political support as well. In particular, younger graduates who have paid fees tend to be more disillusioned than their older older counterparts. And on funding, most people still support a shared model between individuals and the state, but there's growing polarisation and evidence of an increase in the proportion of people who are believing that no students or families should be paying for the cost of tuition. So overall, while support for higher education hasn't exactly collapsed, there are clear and growing concerns about its value, affordability, and its role in the labour market. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. And now we're going to move on to our contributors. So I'm going to first of all ask Annabelle to come over and give her thoughts on the reform chapter.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to offer some reflections on this fascinating research. I think that perhaps the aspect that resonated most with me from the reform chapter was the fact that these voters have a stronger emotional attachment to reform than other voters might to other political parties. Before becoming senior political commentator at The Telegraph, I was the opinion editor. And whenever I would commission articles which cast doubt over reform's prospects or suggested that Kerry Maidenock might be able to claw back some of the voters who reform had peeled off from the Tories, these pieces would be greeted by thousands of comments from reform supporters arguing that the only way is reform and only Farage can fix Britain. So these are often very mobilised individuals who feel absolutely passionately about reform and believe that it really is the panacea that this country needs. In terms of other things that stood out to me, it's useful to look at the broader polling because Reform have topped around 280 consecutive polls now. And what I've found interesting is that they do remain stuck on sort of 27, 28, on a good day, perhaps 30%, because when I have spent time with figures in Reform, they have talked emphatically about what Danny Kruger calls their cascading acceptability and Nigel Farage would describe as respectability. But perhaps even as they appear to morph from a protest movement into a government in waiting, the profile of their supporters hasn't necessarily moved with that. One other thing I draw out is, the survey and the analysis make clear that there is a slight false dichotomy here between people who are driven into the arms of reform on ideology and those who are driven into the arms of reform because they feel such a deep sense of disillusionment with the establishment parties. The great realignment of British politics, which has been underway for about a decade now, is produced by the reality that a very large number of voters, around 35 to 40%, think that national identity and immigration matter more than anything else, and they are looking for a party which will reflect that. But at the same time, they are disgruntled with the establishment because, they think correctly that it's been ignoring their concerns and has been condescending towards them. There's another point I'd draw out from the research, which is sort of struck by how optimistic some reform voters are. I think often there is a stereotype of people who are extremely angry, who will go out and protest in the street against the status quo, who are sort of railing against mass migration, adamant that our country has been broken. But actually, there are a lot of them who simply don't buy into the narrative of managed decline and who truly believe that this insurgent party can turn the oil tanker around. And in some ways, that is detached from the challenge that reform would face were they ever to enter government in a completely unprecedented way. They would have, let's say, 330 MPs, of which only 8 would have been in Parliament before, only a handful would have been ministers, how would they fill ministerial positions? Even the current bunch, the Labour government, do have a lot of ministerial experience amongst them, and they're able to call on Lords in the House of Lords for support. So Reform's task would be absolutely immense, and yet still they are polling in the very high 20%. As John has pointed out, another fascinating aspect of this is where Reform voters stand on the economy and their attitudes towards things like inequality. The left-right divide is simply not what it was before this realignment. The salient issue is not economic, but rather cultural. And there are now very few voters who support political parties which want a more hands-off state, which want to lower taxes, significantly reduce public spending. Rather, we have a growing number of voters who simply don't believe that our current capitalist system is working for them. And this presents an obvious challenge for Nigel Farage, who, when he was campaigning for Brexit, wanted to turn Britain into Singapore-on-Thames. It was all about less dirigisme, less state intervention in the economy and people's lives, broadening people's room for manoeuvre rather than restricting it. And this is the tightrope that Reform needs to walk. And I think that the challenges that they're facing there have been illustrated by recent U-turns on things like the two-child benefit cap and the pensions triple lock. And I think it's going to be a fascinating dynamic within the party, specifically between Robert Jenrick and Nigel Farage over where it settles on economic issues and how it can make the argument for a free market whilst keeping the voters who are on the left on the economy on side. I just wanted to sort of finish by talking a little bit about the how. How has it come to pass that Nigel Farage has capitalised on the disillusionment, on the fact that the salient issue is cultural? And what I've found absolutely fascinating to watch is how unusually effective Reform have been at social media, how Nigel Farage understands the attention economy, and in figures such as Zia Youssef and Robert Jenrick has recruited people who really understand that attention is power. Reform knows how to get clicks and shares, and it understands algorithmic visibility. And I think when you combine this with Nigel Farage's perceived authenticity, the fact that he does pass the pint test, you can understand why they are such a potent political force. Farage has over 1 million TikTok followers. He's got 2.2 million followers on Twitter. He has a GB News programme if you're looking at more traditional media, and writes regularly for traditional media outlets. And through doing all of that, he has managed to reach people who, might otherwise take little interest in conventional politics. When I've spoken to people in Reform, they have repeatedly told me that in addition to scooping up disaffected Tory voters, disaffected Labour voters, actually what they really want is to win over people who haven't voted before. And on the one hand, that very much chimes with the emotional attachment, the loyalty that people feel to Reform if they haven't had any allegiance with a political party in the past. But it's difficult for a political party to translate that support into votes. We live in a world where a vote on your mobile phone for Strictly Come Dancing is the norm, and now what they're expecting is people who've never voted before to trudge down to their local church hall on polling day, perhaps a wet Thursday afternoon, in order to vote for them. So it's a mindset change that will be associated with that, and I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating to see if they are able to succeed. One other point I would just make is that Reform doesn't operate internally like a traditional political party, and I think that is part of its appeal. It's not a members' association, but is owned by a not-for-profit entity, which allows the leadership tighter control. Nigel Farage is very much sort of the CEO. He is the centre of gravity, and Reform has a discipline that I think other political parties can only dream of, certainly that Keir Starmer can only dream of at the moment, the current predicament that he is in. Nevertheless, to win, it's going to need to moderate. It's going to need to do so without alienating the grassroots. It's going to need to be an insurgent force which is anti-establishment, whilst accepting that it's becoming a part of the establishment, which is why I think opinion was so divided when they took in Suella Braverman, Andrew Rosendale and Robert Jenrick earlier this year. Around a third of Tory voters will probably never vote Reform, and about the same amount of their voters won't go Tory. Which leads me just to finish on the questions of pact, because often our readers will say they'd like some signal that there's a willingness for from both sides to work together if it's required to keep out a rainbow coalition on the left. But at the moment, it looks extremely unlikely, and the effect of a pact could be to reduce the number of seats that the two parties win together and thus boost Labour and the Liberal Democrats. Ultimately, the next general election, and probably the one after that, is going to be a complete mess because of the way that our first past the post electoral system translates into an electorate sorting itself into 5 or 6 tribes and 3 or 4 big electoral blocks, and how that is translated into seats. So buckle up. Thank you.
Oh, buckle up indeed. Yes, I think that's probably what we're all getting ready for. Before we go into questions, I'd like to invite Diana to come and talk about the higher education chapter.
Thank you. And good morning. And do let me start by thanking the NatCen team for inviting me here to speak, and indeed for what has been a fantastic report that's already generated significant coverage this week. And while it's good to see the traction that it's received, it does make my job harder this morning, because I've come here thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to add that's different? And indeed not helped by going last on the panel, so bear with me. But I don't want to stand here this morning and repeat the headlines that we've seen. Instead, I want to use the time that I've been given to step back and think about what else this data might be telling us. And I think it reveals something much more significant than just shifting public attitudes to higher education. I think what the data show is that the political settlement underpinning our higher education system is also beginning to fray. So I want to offer 5 reflections this morning just to tease this out a little bit. So first, I think we need to be clear where public support for higher education actually ends. Because despite the headlines that we've all seen about declining public confidence, let's start with the good stuff, this survey does show a public it does not show a public that has turned against higher education altogether. Rather, I think it suggests a much more nuanced picture. It's one where people still support the idea of higher education, but they're becoming increasingly sceptical of the system that we've built around it. And the striking tension for me in the findings is that only 18% of respondents want to reduce opportunities for people to go to university, yet 42% of people believe there are too many graduates. So you can see that the public's almost holding 2 ideas at once. Yes, university still matters to them, but they find the system is not working. And that's a dangerous position for the sector to be in. And building on what we've just heard about reform, I'd actually go as far to describe it as a pre-populist moment, if you like. It's one where the core principle of higher education still commands support, but confidence in how it operates has eroded. And politically, I think that's exactly the kind of space in which more radical policy change could happen to the sector should this or a future government want to do it. So dangerous times. Second, I think that we should be cautious about the idea of thinking that attitudes to higher education are becoming more polarised, with negative attitudes just on the right of the political spectrum. Because actually, if you look a bit closely at the data, these attitudes are converging. Scepticism of higher education is no longer confined to one side of the political spectrum. Yes, Conservative and Reform voters tend to be more negative about higher education, but a significant chunk of Labour and Liberal Democrat voters are also quite sceptical of higher education and think there's too many graduates. And for me, this matters for two reasons. It matters because that left versus right divide is slowly breaking down over time, and it does signal that there's some cross-party appetite for some kind of reform of the sector. And for me, that's arguably a more dangerous position politically for the higher education sector than facing opposition from just one side alone. Because when dissatisfaction becomes mainstream, then it becomes much, much harder to contain. And the sector's task of rebuilding trust becomes far more complex and winning hearts and minds because they're no longer dealing with just one group of voters on one side of the political spectrum. Shameless plug, I argued recently in a debate paper that I wrote for the Higher Education Policy Institute, that higher education is now more exposed than ever. And that's not because of the single political threat that's emerging from the right, but it's because critique of the sector or dissatisfaction with the sector has become shared across the whole political spectrum. No party now offers the sector its unqualified support, and I suspect no single party would lose political capital defending it. And I think that's what we see reflected here in the data. The sector is at risk of losing its allies and its advocates fast. My third point also picks up on another area of convergence, and that's around the immigration question, which I think seems to have become the sector's biggest blind spot. For me, the most worrying data point concerns public's attitudes towards international student migration. The survey shows that 67% of the public now support some limits on international student recruitment, and that includes majorities across voters of all the major political parties. And that fact alone should set alarm bells ringing, not least because universities have become structurally dependent on international student income. Yet public consent for that model is shifting decisively in the other direction. Let me put it another way. It means that the financial sustainability of the sector now rests on a policy position that lacks broad public backing. And once again, that is a precarious position for the sector to be in. Because if we take a step back and think about what the practicalities of what that means, I'd also suggest that it raises questions about the long-term viability of policies such as the graduate route, which already feels fragile after successive governments have been chipping away at its terms and conditions. So I think as we move towards the next general election in a few years, I would suggest that this is the biggest political pressure point for the sector, for universities across all four parts of the UK, because that isn't a devolved issue. And I think it's one where, unfortunately, the sector may be living on borrowed time. Fourth, I'm going to say that I don't think the sector isn't just losing support, but it also risks losing legitimacy and its licence to operate as well. We've all seen the headlines, I am coming back to headlines now, that only 36% of respondents believe graduates are better off financially, while 34% think going to university is not worth the time and money. These are both significant shifts that have occurred over time, and for me, they cut right to the heart of the sector's legitimacy challenge. That's because the expansion of higher education was built on a simple promise that going to university would improve your life chances. But we can see that that promise is now under strain. While higher education was once framed as an investment, it's now increasingly being perceived as a risk. And for me, this isn't just about fees or debt either. The survey makes clear that people are now judging the value of higher education through labour market outcomes and whether graduates are going on to secure the jobs and the salaries that they were led to expect. And if that connection weakens, as it appears to be doing, then we really shouldn't be surprised if the foundations of the current model are beginning to wobble. And if that wasn't bad enough, I do normally like to be optimistic, promise. My fifth and final point is that the generational divide is becoming increasingly politically charged as well. We've already heard from Alex that the survey highlights a striking disparity, namely those who benefited from free higher education are more likely to support student contributions than those who've paid £9,000 fees. And I think this is it's certainly a remarkable reversal from what I would expect. We've somehow created a system in which those who paid nothing for their own higher education are most comfortable defending high costs for the next generation. And this isn't just a policy issue, this is a question of fairness in our society. And it feeds into a wider sense in young people that they're paying more for less certain returns, and all within a system that's designed by those who face fewer costs and constraints on their own future prospects than they are. And when you set this against all the wider pressures facing today's graduates, you know, inflated house prices, job insecurity, the threat of disruption from AI and technological change, then this really becomes fertile ground, a battleground between the generations. And that is precisely the kind of dynamic that the sector needs to be alert to, once again in an age of growing populism, to link it back to the other report. So to conclude and to bring all my 5 points together, I'd say the real risk for the sector from this survey is complacency. The survey has given us a range of warning signs. We now know there's rising scepticism about the value of higher education. We know there's some cross-party appetite for reform. We know there's strong support for limits on international student recruitment, and we know there's growing intergenerational tensions. And when we take these together, these suggest that we cannot simply assume that public support for higher education will hold. Yes, the majority of the public still see the value of higher education, but we've seen over time that these public perceptions are declining fast. And the message from the British public is quite clear. It's more conditional than just showing outright support from our universities. What they're telling us is that they support higher education, but not in its current form, or indeed not in the form that it's become. So this has created a window of opportunity for us, I think, in the sector, and indeed the government, to make changes that the public may respond positively to. But the flip side of this is that the window could also narrow if public perceptions harden. So I suppose the question I want to leave you with this morning, and indeed my fellow colleagues in the sector, is, are we willing to respond to that challenge, or are we going to wait for others to do it to us? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Danny. You've posed a question to me as well about whether I stick with higher education or go back to reform for the next set of questions, because that was a really thought-provoking set of points, so thank you very much for that, and we will come back to you. But first of all, I'm going to go to John. So your analysis shows that Reform has inherited this socially conservative coalition that abandoned the Conservatives, that voted for Let's Get Brexit Done in 2019. Do you think that that coalition is theirs to keep, or do you think that they're vulnerable to Restore Britain or a repositioned Conservative or Labour Party?
Okay, so I think you certainly can't assume that it's theirs to keep, because they've already proven to be remarkably volatile. I mean, they were, first of all, gathered, historically, they have been divided. If you look particularly at the character of support for the Labour Party, you go back to the 20 years, whether you were a social liberal or a social conservative was unrelated to whether you voted Labour or not. So, first of all, as kind of in turning with Annabelle's comments, for which many thanks, Annabelle, the tribe has become more distinct and more recognised in terms of the way which it expresses itself politically. And Brexit has helped to crystallise that process. And first of all, the tribe decided that they would pitch their tent inside the Conservative Party. And that reached its zenith back in 2019. But since then, partly as a consequence of the general problems facing the Conservative Party in the wake of Partygate and the Liz Truss fiscal event, but also undoubtedly the way in which, when the Conservative Party decided to equalise the rules on immigration for EU and non-EU citizens, we liberalised the views for non-EU citizens. And that, together with events such as Ukraine, Hong Kong, meant we ended up with that very, very high level of migration from, was it 2023 of around 900,000. And people who voted for Brexit now feel that Brexit has resulted in an increase in immigration, which is the very, very opposite of what they wanted. So you can certainly therefore see why this tribe was potentially loose. Basically, half of the tribe switched from the Conservatives to Reform by the time of the 2024 general election. and the other half have switched seats. And one of the consequences of that, we're not quite there yet, but we're now almost at the point where support for the Conservative Party is barely any higher amongst those people who voted Leave than it was amongst those who voted Remain, which, given this is the party that delivered Brexit, is a fundamental change. So now, and in a sense, the question that Annabelle didn't raise, which I was kind of slightly surprised about, is, well, so what are the Conservative Party going to do about it? Because in a sense, insofar as this tribe exists but has so far proven itself to be potentially mobile, is that it would seem that the Conservative Party has to work out how the hell it's going to get them back. At the moment, the answer seems to be, well, actually, we're going to focus on economics, where I think Annabelle quite thoughtfully said potentially this is an area of disagreement amongst the tribe, because what unites them is their social conservatism, is not their attitudes towards economic issues. And I think what we do know is that while polling evidence suggests that Reform supporters very, very much do believe that Nigel Farage and the Reform Party would be able to reduce immigration. They believe Boris Johnson, and now they believe Nigel Farage on that. What they are much less certain about is about the ability of Reform to turn around the economy and on that issue. So at the moment, the answer of the Conservative Party seems to be, in a sense, is to try to shift the agenda away from focusing on these social conservative issues, because in a sense, it's very, very difficult to out Farage. That's what the Conservative Party has found so far, and try to shift the agenda. I guess the question is, however, that does require the Conservative Party to be able to come up with a message on the economy that A, proves to be a valid and effective critique of the current government's regime, and which also convinces Reform supporters. And here the problem, of course, is that the real baggage that surrounds the Conservative Party and is still dragging it down is the fact that not many people are sure that it's capable of providing us with competent government in any kind of area. And until it can overcome that problem, and it's always very difficult for a government that's been rejected on grounds of competence to regain its reputation with competence anytime soon.
Thank you. So I don't think there's many people who are avid BSA watchers who were here this time last year, but for those of you that were, you may remember that I asked John a question that time about whether we were moving towards a multi-party system. And I think at the time it was very much within the Labour Party's gift to shore up its supporters and its voters. So asking you again, are we moving towards a multi-party system, and is it now defined by deep ideological blocks rather than swing voters?
Well, okay. So the question that was posed by the 2024 election, is presumably what I was reflecting on last year, was undoubtedly, would the traditional two-party system survive? Because the proportion of people who were supporting either Conservative or Labour was below 60% for the first time since 1922. In the opinion polls now, and this has been the position since the autumn, it's less than 40%. If you look at the results of the local and devolved elections on May the 7th, they are frankly awful, absolutely awful for both Conservatives and Labour. The message of the opinion polls is thoroughly reinforced. And to that extent, at least, where we are now is that 12 months on, it's very, very clear we are currently operating in a world of multi-party politics. And certainly what is true is, again, this is the remark I was making towards the end, and why it does change the nature of the game. The crucial thing is not just that we've got these two dimensions, but the two dimensions are, to use a mathematical term, they're virtually orthogonal to each other. That is, that whether you are a right-wing or left-wing is unrelated to whether you're a social liberal or a social conservative. Just think of the Home Secretary, economically left-wing, but socially very, very clearly conservative. And the consequence of that is that the centre, the traditional kind of politics of the Conservative and Labour parties is in the end to create relatively large coalitions of voters, and doing that by positioning themselves, in the case of the Conservatives, a wee bit to the right of centre, and in the case of the Labour Party, a wee bit to the left of centre. The problem now is, however, is that because those two dimensions are unrelated to each other, the proportion of people who are in the centre, that is, they are on the centre on both dimensions, is inevitably much smaller than the proportion of people who were in the centre when our politics was largely unidimensional. And what that therefore means, and what is that, and this is why I think there are structural changes which take us in the multi-politics direction. It does mean that that fundamental assumption that the Conservative Party will make, it doesn't matter where we move to, so long as we're still to the right of Labour, it's impossible for anybody to set up camp in a more extreme position than us. And the fundamental assumption the Labour Party made is, we can always go towards the centre because the folk who are to the left don't have anywhere else to go. That assumption no longer looks to be valid. And the Conservative Party has lost just a whole barrel load of voters to reform on the social conservative agenda. Oh, and by the way, Labour Party's principal problem is not reform. Its principal problem in terms of voters are the Greens, and the fact that the Greens are picking up the more socially liberal and left-wing end of the Labour coalition. So certainly insofar as our politics have become two-dimensional in the post-Brexit world, it does mean that structurally the game is different, and trying to occupy the centre ground is no longer necessarily an effective strategy, and that creating the kind of large coalitions we historically have. I mean, all of that said, I think what then also flows from this is, and again, it's something that Annabelle quite correctly referred to, we should at the same time always bear in mind that support for reform is only at 27, 28%. That has never previously been a winning number in British politics. But because of the fragmentation of our politics, it is now potentially a winning number. But I would certainly agree with Annabelle. And again, the implication of the research is because support for reform is so heavily invested in social conservatives, and however you look at it, social conservatives probably don't make up much more than 40% of the population. There is clearly likely to be a plateau to what they can achieve. It's just that they've been very, very successful at maintaining themselves towards the top end of that potential plateau.
Thank you. Before I move to Annabelle, there was one question that she posed, which you sort of touched on just now with the where reform are polling. But given that, as Annabelle says, part of their strategy is also to appeal to those that have never voted but might support reform.
Yeah.
Is there anything in the survey results that would indicate what would make those potential reform voters actually go to the ballot box when they haven't been before?
Well, the answer to you is that certainly it's in the British social attitudes data that we're talking about today. It's also in most of the polling data. Those people who did not vote in 2024 are, if they express an opinion at all, and many of them don't, are more likely to support reform than anybody else. The challenge, however, is whether or not reform, as Annabelle quite rightly said, can get these voters to the polls. I think the only thing we know at the moment, and we should be very careful about inferring cause and effect, but certainly the turnout in the local elections in England on May the 7th, which in the sample of results the BBC collected, which was about half of them, was just over 40%, was well up on what we would normally expect for local elections. Now, whether or not that's just simply the polarisation of the public and the fact that we've got lots of parties appealing to niche markets relatively successfully, that's one explanation. The other is that, is at least in part the result of the fact that because reform are now there, some people who certainly wouldn't bother with local government elections turned up to the polls. So the answer to is that a potential source of support for reform, it does appear to be the socially conservative folk who have hitherto gone, not worth it, politicians don't listen to us, etc., etc.
Thank you. Annabelle, so the data shows that reform support is rooted in both dissatisfaction and a distinctly socially conservative worldview. In this context, can Labour realistically speak to both to stay in power?
Well, what I thought was quite interesting in the aftermath of the May elections was initially a lot of the analysis suggested it was vindication for Morgan McSweeney, who was part of Labour Together, who is very close to Maurice Glassman, who runs Blue Labour and is considered to be on the right of the party. And what Morgan had consistently said was that Labour needed to find a way to win back voters who were flocking to reform, traditional working class voters who felt that the establishment had failed them, who were very resistant to such things as net zero and the impact on jobs, obviously immigration as well. And it was something that wing of Labour believed to be possible. But I think it's become quite clear, as John has identified, that the true threat to this, the Labour government, the Labour Party, is coming from its left flank. It's coming from the Greens. And what's been interesting just in the last couple of weeks is how Wes Streeting, who is considered the Blairite leadership hopeful, if he's able to get 81 MPs to support him, is really pushing quite left-wing messaging at the moment, specifically on Brexit. It's Wes Streeting who's come out and suggested that he wants to rejoin, and obviously that is Green Party policy. So I think in some ways it doesn't necessarily matter if appealing to traditional working class voters is in Labour's electoral interests. The fact is, whoever replaces Keir Starmer, if indeed they're able to defenestrate him, is going to move the party in a more left-wing direction, be that Andy Burnham or even Shabana Mahmood or Wes Streeting, who are considered to be on the right of the party. I think there's been an acceptance that those voters are lost to reform, and there's no way for them to win them back over.
I think that's fair. This is slightly an unfair question, so I apologise about this. But it was really rooted in what you said right at the end about buckling up for the next couple of elections. Given that, you know, everything that we've seen from the polling, but also everything that we've seen from the BSA with this, you know, with the Greens sitting at one end and Reform sitting at the other, and taking voters and supporters from all the traditional parties. What do you think that means for the next couple of elections?
I thought you were going to ask me to
Sorry, unfair.
No, I refuse to do crystal ball gazing. What I think it's going to mean is...
You just asked me, don't you, to do it? That's what I was on.
What I think is it's just going to be absolute chaos like we saw in the 1920s. And nobody can possibly say what is going to happen. There will be an enormous amount, I think, of tactical voting, and that is going to throw up all sorts of anomalies because many constituents are not going to have the granular data required to truly understand which party to support in order to keep out Reform or to keep out the Greens or to keep out Labour. So it is highly volatile, highly unpredictable. You know, and as I said, you know, a big question is whether there is going to be a willingness among parties on the left and parties on the right to work together. It isn't just the personality clash between Nigel Farage and Kemi Badenoch. It's also between Zach Polanski and Keir Starmer, if indeed he is able to limp on until 2029, which I agree seems it's very unlikely at this stage. But Polanski has made clear that he would not be willing to work with Keir Starmer, whilst he would a figure such as Andy Burnham. So we could have a hung parliament, we could have a coalition government. You know, if you speak to Reform, they're absolutely insistent that they can get the numbers. They believe that 30% will allow them to win a general election. And I'll just use this opportunity to touch on a point that John raised earlier, which is what on earth can the Tories do to try and win back over some of the voters they've lost to Reform. In the aftermath of May, I spoke to some Tory councillors who were slightly bemused and disappointed that they'd done quite so badly in view of how unpopular the Labour administration is. And what I think the party has struggled to grapple with is just how deep the sense of betrayal voters feel with the Tory party is. The fact that they repeatedly voted for lower immigration only to be for the Tories to deliver the opposite. And as John has highlighted, there is that competence question as well. Time heals wounds. Look at what happened after 1997, how long it took for the Tories to come back into power. I personally believe that Kemi Badenoch's strategy is the right one, and she took a lot of criticism for wanting to take her time, wanting to ensure that she wasn't shooting policy from the hip, that the Tories could clearly set out exactly how they would deliver on the promises they were making. And I do believe that could potentially pay off. She is obviously very popular personally relative to the Conservative Party, whose brand is completely toxic 2 years after the last general election. She will hope that helps win voters over, that she is able to convince them that this is a new era for the Tories, that was the old Conservative Party and that this is the new. Obviously, she's leaned heavily on economic issues because many members of the public still believe that the Tories are the safe pair of hands at the tiller. And if you look at Tory polling and Kemi's approval ratings, they did spike in the aftermath of her party conference speech last autumn, where she announced that the Tories would, if they ever find a way back into power, scrap stamp duty. That was a popular policy among some of the voters that they would have lost. However, just final point, I think for all the difficulty and the internal wrangling that there might be within reform over economic issues, what Nigel Farage believes is going to become a key divide, is becoming a key divide in Britain, is between the workers and the workless. And if he can find a way to instill in people the sense of unfairness over work and those who contribute and those who don't contribute, as he did with immigration, then that may help him navigate those difficult waters.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. That was masterfully sidestepped my horrible question as well. Alex, I want to move on to you first. Diana mentioned my favourite stat in the chapter about, or two stats, about 42% of the public think there are too many graduates, but only 18% want fewer university places. What do you think that tells us about, this contradiction tells us about the route forward for higher education? And if I may tack on another question to that, and about what policy choices are there for the current and future government about funding?
Yeah.
I like harder questions.
I think it is. It's an interesting distinction, that question between opportunities and the recent number of graduates. Clearly, Diana was right to highlight. I mean, the proportion who want opportunities to be reduced has increased from the last time we asked the question, but it's still at a pretty low level, and it's still the option that the fewest proportion of people choose. So, despite the fact that there's a concern, and a maintained concern, about whether universities are delivering the right number of graduates for the job market, there's still a hesitancy among the public to then go to the further step of saying, well, actually, what we want is for the university numbers to be reduced. Perhaps that's because of the way, the nature of the question. If you're saying that you're denying opportunities or reducing opportunities, there's quite a commitment to say that, and possibly we would need a higher proportion of people thinking that there's too many recent university graduates than there are currently, because around the same proportion of people who think there are too many also think there are about the right level of graduates, which kind of indicates that even though there's a lot of public attention on graduate oversupply, the relatively small graduate premium that the UK has compared to other nations, and the reduced graduate premium that the UK has experienced, it's still the case that the public has not completely turned against higher education as an institution, even though it's almost like a caution rather than a complete rebuke of the sector.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the audience in a minute, so have your questions ready. But Diana, I thank you so much for your really thoughtful contribution, and your peroration saying that basically the sector needs to think themselves what the solutions are really caught me. And I wondered if you had any first thoughts about what the sector should do to help solve this. this challenge?
Have you got a magic wand? I think if I had that answer, I might be in another job. Love my job. I do think the sector needs to be having some honest conversations now, given all that we know about changing public sentiment. I love the sector, don't get me wrong, but I don't think we can go on pretending that we are one homogenous whole, because we're not. That's what's so great about the UK higher education sector. The strength is in its diversity. There's something for everyone, for art, science, old, new, big, small. And we all serve different purposes. Some are urban, some are rural, some have international cohorts and international brand and reach. Some are more local. And I think we do need to start having that conversation. Maybe we don't need that one-size-fits-all funding settlement or one-size-fits-all regulation, which I know is already burdensome on some parts of the sector. It's not a difficult conversation, because I know people will say straight away, well, we don't want to go back to the age of the polys versus the universities. And I'm not advocating for that at all. But maybe there is another way that suits the current climate. And you can tell it's really difficult. No one's got an answer for this. But I do think we need to start having those conversations, because only then will we be able to tease that out.
Thank you. And before I go to the audience, one more. So the data talks about dissatisfaction with higher education driven more by poor job outcomes than by debt. So what do you think the sector can do themselves to help support the young people in their universities to be ready for the world of work?
This is really difficult, because it's a problem that's bigger than universities, because in that respect, we're part of the supply chain. We provide the skills to send the graduates out into the workforce, and if those skills don't match with the current change that's happening, particularly with AI and technological change, which I mentioned, then of course it's going to reflect back on what universities do. And universities, to their credit, are grappling with this at the moment. I'm hosting a conference next week in my own university on grappling digital and technological change. But that's going to take time, and I don't think we're moving as fast as the change that's happening. So a lot of this, we need to be having conversations with the employers out there. I'm not saying education should be employer-led, but they do know and they can anticipate what's coming in their own sectors and industries, and we need to be sure that we're feeding that back in. We're actually embracing the employability narrative and not just talking about it. We're actually working with business partners, giving students internships and placements as part of their programs, really embedding that into the curricula and making them as work-ready as they can be.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to open it up to those of you in the room. We've got some roving mics, and I'll probably take a couple of questions at a time. So would anyone like to start? Let's do the three on this row to make the mics easy, and then we'll come over to you guys.
Hi, thanks, David Churchill from the Daily Mail. Just a couple of questions for John, if I may. Is it too much to say that Reform is now the new party of the working class? I mean, obviously, you know, you talked about they tend to be people who haven't been to university, maybe struggle a little bit more with household budgets. You know, have they overtaken Labour? Is that you know, is that their new sort of, you know, can they boast that, do you think? And just quickly, the Henry Novak case has sadly become a bit political. Who do you think, sort of ahead of the Makerfield by-election, who do you think will of the party leaders, who will, you know, whose sort of stance will the voters there kind of most identify with, and will that affect the outcome of the by-election in any way at all, do you think?
Keep moving down just for now to get three questions, and then we'll do them all.
Thanks. My question's also about Reform. I was very struck by Annabelle saying that Reform, if they were elected, would find it very difficult to govern from where they are now. But in fact, that's exactly what they are doing in local government. They've actually won quite a lot of councils. And I just wondered whether you think, given how optimistic Reform voters are about the change that Reform are going to achieve, whether you think any disillusionment will set in those some quite large counties where Reform are leading.
Thank you. And I think the lady on the end of your row had a question.
Yes, mine was about, well, I have two questions. One which was about the left-wing, right-wing, social conservative, social liberal. Are we being too kind of vague about social conservatism when actually what we really want to say is immigration? So that's one thing. So specify things a little bit more. And then about higher education. Alex mentioned that there's a sort of smaller graduate premium here than in other countries. So could we have some more of those comparisons? How comes there's a greater graduate premium in some other countries? But there's a second part to this question, which is about, if not university, then what? For those people who are achieving at those levels that people have to now achieve to get into universities in the first place. So what is the policy which improves dramatically, not just throw out some let's do vocational education, but some very well-resourced, well-planned, I saw something about the Dutch the other day, something which looks like potentially improving the prospects for the young people.
Thank you very much. So, John, the first couple of questions on reform, whether the Henry Novak tragedy will affect the by-election, and does social conservatism mean actually immigration or positions on immigration?
Yeah, and there's also a question about the working class, which was the much easier one. So the answer to is that so the only party now whose support is higher amongst working class voters than it is amongst middle class voters. So I'm looking at the character of support. I'm not saying that most working class people are voting reform, because all our parties are minorities, right? Nobody is commanding any section of the electorate. But what is true is that Reform are now the only party that are more popular within people who are in working class occupations than those who are middle class occupations. What the chapter goes on to argue, however, is that is essentially a product of the fact that the real division is education. The link between these two chapters, right, is that education and whether or not you've been to university is now also a fault line in our politics, because university graduates tend to be socially liberal, and people who have not been to university are less likely to be social liberal. So as that aspect of our politics become more important, so one of the reasons why, as it were, universities are now in a more politically contentious space is that the attitudes that are relatively common amongst university graduates are the ones that are being challenged by the rise of reform. And certainly, the Labour Party, the link between the Labour Party and voting for the working class began to decline. Well, it's quite a long-term process, but certainly the advent of New Labour saw the link decline, and basically Brexit killed it off. But we should also be aware, by the way, again, this is one of the challenges of the Conservative Party, the Conservative Party is not more popular amongst middle-class voters than it is amongst working-class voters. Both Labour and the Conservatives have lost their traditional demographic anchor, which again is one of the structural changes that's occurred to our politics that makes it think that it's going to be now more likely for both of them to get back to where they were. In terms of Makerfield, the short answer to is none of us knows what's going to happen in Makerfield. We've had one very small opinion poll which kind of said, well, maybe Andy Burnham's 3 points ahead, but well within the margin of error. In a sense, the crucial message from that poll, insofar as it's right at all, was that half the public said they were going to vote for one of Reform, Conservative or Restore Britain, and the other half said they were going to vote for one of Labour, the Greens or Liberal Democrats. And it may well be a question of which of those two blocks ends up being the less fragmented of the two when it comes. I mean, whether the Henry Novak story, the Henry Novak story certainly enables Farage to articulate a view that Reform are commonly articulating. It's one of their calling cards, which is to be critical of diversity and inclusion policy. And so it certainly therefore provides a means by which he can mobilise a group of people who our research shows that is indeed what they believe, right? Whether or not it's actually going to be able to bring more people into the fold who are of that view is inevitably very, very difficult to tell. About reform in local governments, the answer to you is not so far, right? They've been running a number of significant county councils for a while with varying degrees of success, and certainly not much success in terms of being able to reduce the council tax in the way that they'd anticipated, because they kind of discovered that basically most of what county councils do is legislated for by law, and you've got to look after the old people that are there, and that's a real a fiscal challenge for all local government in the UK at the moment. In terms of social conservatism, well, it isn't just about immigration, because actually and this is the fascinating thing, the questions that we use to define where people are on this social liberal, social conservative spectrum are actually are not substantively anything to do with immigration or anything to do with equalities policies. They're essentially about whether or not you value order in society, rather, and in particular the extent to which you say, young people don't have enough respect for traditional values. We should still have the death penalty. So they're actually items which are rather closer to what we might think of as being to some degree law and order issues. It so happens that these items end up correlating very, very strongly with A, Brexit, B, immigration, B, C, diversity policy, and to some degree also attitudes towards welfare. So it is a much broader constellation of things that goes well beyond the items that are actually used to form that scale that we use to illustrate that broad conceptual terrain.
Thanks, John. Alex, do you want to take the two questions on higher education, the graduate premium, why the graduate premium is higher in other countries, and if not university, then what?
Yeah, sure. So on the graduate premium, we referenced a piece in the Financial Times by Bern Murdoch, who'd looked at the graduate premium across various different nations, and I'm sure there are various factors that feed into that. I mean, one of the developments in the last few years in the UK, at least, has been the large increase in the minimum wage, and if non-graduates are more likely to be on minimum wage jobs than graduates are, so we're seeing a sort of middling where graduate jobs have not kept pace with inflation as much, whereas there's been the increase of the minimum wage, so sort of narrowing between the two, which means the graduate premium in the UK gets reduced if graduate salaries aren't keeping pace. So there's that factor. In terms of if not university or what, it's a very, very difficult question and not one that we asked respondents. I mean, so we can't really tell the public attitudes of what would be the alternatives if their skepticism about university education is there. All we know really is that skepticism about the value of university education has increased. Public confidence as to whether it's worth the money is low. I mean, 77% of us say a degree is just not good value for money. And that's increased from around 50% when we last asked that question a decade ago. So there's clearly growing and significant concerns about the value of a university education, but what would be the alternative to that if not university is an open question. And I think the whole argument behind university expansion when it was initially done and that there was more university places made available was that we're growing into a knowledge economy, we're going to need all of these graduates with certain skills to fill those places within the economy, and it seems that more and more people are becoming disillusioned, and especially younger people who have gone through that system of the higher of the university tuition fee system, coming out the other end and finding that promise that the graduate jobs will be there is not being fulfilled. So it's a difficult question. I don't know.
I was wondering if Diana had another view on.
Look at me for that one.
Yeah.
And help you out on if not HE, then what? I think the obvious answer, and the one that I sort of wince at when I hear it, is do an apprenticeship instead. Now, apprenticeships are absolutely great, but the number's minuscule. The supply of them far outstrips demand, and that's not going to change overnight. So for those who get them, great, they can actually earn money rather than having to pay fees. But that's only for the privileged few, and I think we need to face that. There's a huge sort of equality issue with apprenticeships. I think the other thing we need to remember is that employers are not training providers. They're not going to go out and do the training or offer the training, and we can see that with the poor uptake of the apprenticeship levy that we've had over recent years. It just isn't working. So we're always going to need higher skills providers, be they universities or FE colleges. I think where universities could change is that maybe we don't actually need the full-time 3-year, 4-year degree anymore to go into the workforce. So we've got to embrace the lifelong learning agenda that's coming. Maybe the way forward is a more step-on, step-off educational experience, so students can go for 1 year, get what you call a level 4, level 5 in our sort of technical language, then maybe go back a little bit later and do that top-up. And you can keep doing that as skills change throughout your lifetime. And I think that is actually the future of higher education, rather than the full-time model that we have at the moment.
Thank you. I'm going to try and take a couple more questions if the timing will allow me.
I might just say a few
Oh,
things
sorry.
on the council records
Yes, sorry,
question,
you
if
were
that's
asked
all
that
right.
question on the council.
No.
Go ahead.
Well, because I think it's a really important one. One of reform's great advantages is that it has the luxury of no record to defend. So it can criticise the 14 years of Conservative government, it can criticise the 2 years of Labour government from, the pub bar, and nobody is going to throw back at them, well, when you were in power, taxes went up and so did public spending, and boats kept coming and the borders were open. Of course, now they do have councils to run. They've got an outright majority in 24, and they're the largest party in 8. And they've come under quite a lot of fire for their record in the first year that they began to run councils, not least the fact, as John mentioned, that they increased council tax, although Nigel Farage would emphatically tell you that he never promised to reduce income tax for council tax, rather that they would do all that they could to raise it by the absolute minimum. Now, in defence of reform, the councils they inherited were in a state of genuine ruin. They were in debt, they had depleted reserves, and of course they have these statutory obligations, above all, adult social care. It is extremely difficult to make local authority budget cuts. That doesn't perhaps quite help explain why it was that they lost 74 of their 677 councillors within a year to defection and suspension and resignation and expulsion. But I think that the council tax issue in particular really highlights the difficulties that reform will have, keeping the public on side. If they come into government and they struggle to deliver, their priority will have to be immigration. Their 2024 manifesto promised to stop the boats within 100 days. Now, they might subsequently say that it was more a provocation than it was a plan for government. But if the public does not begin to see some improvement in that area, I think in particular within 6 months, or if you're being extremely generous, a year, then they will turn against reform as quickly as they have turned against the Tories and they've turned against the Labour government. That's the reality of the political era that we're living in, with an extremely fractious electorate.
Thank you, Annabelle. A couple more questions, I think, if we've got time. Okay, so there's 2 people over here.
Hi, thanks. I was going to ask about the attitudes to higher education and whether you looked at the regional or geographical breakdown. And the kind of context to that is obviously participation rates to higher education vary massively across the country. If you grow up in London, you're much more likely to go to higher education. You've got many more universities around you. You're much more likely to have friends, relatives that have experienced higher education. So did you look at it? Is there any kind of relationship there with people's attitude to higher education? Because I feel that might then tell you something interesting about the extent to which it's national debates and that are affecting people's attitude or their local experience and knowledge of the kind of university offer around them.
Fantastic. We'll just take one from the lady next to you as well.
Hi, also perfect segue, so you can take them very easily together. I'm Linton Lees, I'm at Public First, and we do a lot of public opinion polling on reform voters' attitudes to higher education, so this has been great to be in concert with that. One of the things that we found is that when you ask people about individual returns on degrees, they're a bit more dubious and getting more dubious, but when you ask them, how do you feel about your local university? The worst they say is they're ambivalent, and the best they say is it's, it brings huge jobs. It's the reason the high street's better. They feel better about international students purely on a kind of local kind of financial reason. They know that's the reason that the high street has brought in money in many towns, for instance. I'm wondering, to Diana's point about a positive story for the sector and where political capital might, be extracted from reluctant governments, whether the local angle, universities have got a lot to do to fix the narrative about their local contributions, but given the public, and including reform curious voters, do understand that universities are really locally important and would, not be very happy if thousands of jobs went and a university went under. If that's maybe where there's some narrative to be built.
Thank you. So 2 good questions on the local impact of universities. Do you want to take do you want to give your comments and then Diana?
Yeah, sure. On the question on region, it's a good point. It's not something we looked at specifically. We had a challenge in the chapter in general that we have a fairly low base size. I mean, in England, we had around 800 or so respondents. So then when you're getting down to individual regions, depending on how broad or how particular you want to be, specifically if you were looking at particular universities or particular locations, it would become a challenge to get robust percentages. But it's a fair point, and I think the differences by grads and non-grads is interesting throughout the report in how they perceive the in their perceptions of higher education. And I think if you were to look in particular at, say, university towns versus, more rural areas or places where there are more graduates than fewer, those type of attitudes will probably be reflected in those regions as well.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much for raising the civic point. I'm probably going to end on a point of agreement because I totally think that is the way forward. The civic university movement, which I know you've been involved in, I think has been a game changer for the sector. It's got institutions to actually think about their role in their local places. And that gets expressed in a variety of ways, from physical presence on the high streets to the amount of people they employ, the skills they provide, the money they bring in. And universities have caught on to that. There's a lot of economic impact reports at the moment. But my challenge to the sector is, they're well and good, but do the people on the street, the people that might vote reform, does that really resonate with them? Do they know what £49 billion is? They want to feel something tangible. So my challenge to the sector is, yes, embrace the civic university movement, but do it in a way that people understand and what that brings to them. And I think that's the piece we haven't got right yet.
Thank you very much. It just leaves me to thank everybody for coming today and for joining us online, to thank our wonderful speakers, John, Alex, Annabelle and Diana, for their great contributions. Please do stay around those in the room to speak to the speakers and to have another drink and another canapé, and those online. Thank you very much for joining us and making time for us today. Thank you.